So what are the next steps? This can be a challenging part of building an application. You know what the end result should be, but getting there can be tricky. Well, what I like to do is I like to simply plan out the application step by step. And here we know that first of all, we want to tell the user that we now need his or her weight and height. So we first of all want to output information to the user, information about what we need. So some message describing the overall application, for example. Then we want to prompt for user input. So then we want to get that weight and height. We want to show a message like, please enter your weight in kilograms, and then read the user input. Something we haven't done before in the course, but something we'll learn about in this course section. Then as a next step, we want to save that user input in variables so that we can use it in calculations. And then we want to calculate the BMI, and the formula for that is simply weight divided by height times height. So that should be in parentheses here, mathematically seen, because we have to derive this first and then take the result of height times height and divide weight by it. And that's then the BMI, and then as a last step, we want to output the calculated BMI. These are the different steps we want to go through. And therefore, let's now simply go through them step by step. And I'll start by outputting some information. Instead of saying hello world, I'll say BMI calculator as a first step, and then print another line thereafter where I simply output a couple of dashes like this. So this is basically just showing some title for our application then, and then a little separator. Now below that, I want to prompt the user for input, and I want to read what the user entered. So here I want to again print something, but now not println, but just print, to not add a line break, because actually I want to show a message and then accept the user input in the same line as I showed this message. So here I want to say, please enter your weight in kilograms, then a colon and then a white space, and then thereafter the user should enter his or her weight. And of course we want to do the same for the height, which we want to get in meters. But of course, in between these two steps, we also want to get the actual user input and store it in a variable. And as a side note, I'm building this BMI calculator in the metric system here. Of course, you could also use other units and just adjust the formula accordingly. But it's not so much about the BMI here and about how we calculate it, but about building this with Go and practicing Go. That's why I'll stick to the metric system only here. But now back to our input here. We prompt the user for something, but now we need to read what the user enters and store it in a variable. And that's what we'll do next. Now, reading some user input from the command line and storing it in a variable is something we haven't done before. But Go simply has another package that helps us. Just as we have the FMT package for formatting text and potentially outputting text in the command line, like we're doing it here in all these steps, we also get a package that helps us with getting user input. For this, actually outside of this main function, I'll create a new variable, reader, which is initialized to a value which I get from the buff.io package, which is also built into Go just as the FMT package is. If we start typing, we should get the auto-completion, and if I select buff.io and hit tab, this import statement changes and buff.io is added there. Now on buff.io we can call new reader like this, and this will give us a new reader thing, which is a tool, you could say, created by Go that helps us read user input from the command line. To be precise, it is actually able to read it from different sources, and to read it from the command line, we need to pass a value to new reader between those parentheses, and we get that value from another Go package by typing OS, hitting tab to add the import, and then .stdin, which stands for standard input, which is the command line. The command line is the standard input interface. And that now creates a reader that is able to read from that command line. Now I'm storing it in a variable, and I'm doing it outside of main. We could also do it inside of main. I'm just doing it here to also practice again that we can create variables outside of functions as well. Now with that, we got our reader here, and now we can use that reader to, well, get some user input. For that, down here in the place where we need that input, in the main function below this first prompt here, I actually will use my reader variable, and we can use a variable defined outside of a function in any function, because variables defined outside of functions are global variables, which are globally available in that package, so you can use them everywhere there. And here in that main function, I now use reader, and we then add a dot again and access read string here. Now, read string is a command available on this reader tool, so to say, that actually will read the user input, and it reads the input until the user presses a certain character. So until a certain character is found. And here, read string actually wants a byte as a value that we pass between those parentheses. So it actually looks for a character that is represented as a byte. And that should make sense if you recall what you learned in the previous section. We learned about runes and bytes and strings. And if we are looking for a certain character to be pressed, it makes sense that read string is looking for a byte, since a byte is a single character, as you saw before. A single standard character. And here we'll use for a slightly special character, which is still supported by the byte type, and that's \n, which represents a line break, so when the enter key is pressed. And therefore, by using reader read string with this byte passed to read string, we are basically reading the user input, so whatever the user enters, until the user hits the enter key, which is of course what we typically do as a user if we want to submit and confirm our input. So when that enter key is pressed, the reader will stop reading here and will then return the input entered by the user that was read by that reader. And therefore we want to store that input. And I'll add a new variable here, input text, and store what read string returns in it. But you'll notice that I got a couple of red squiggly lines here. And I got those because actually read string does something we haven't seen before. It does not just yield one value, but two values. Now that's a behavior I'll come back to in the functions course section, and for the moment we'll just ignore it. But to handle it correctly, we should therefore also create two variables on the left side of the := operator. And we do that by adding a comma here, and then an underscore, which is a special syntax in Go, telling Go that we don't care about the second value returned by read string, because again, that is something we'll explore later in the course. This, however, will give us access to the entered value, the input text, and we can then work with that. And actually, I'll not name it input text, but maybe wait input, since we are waiting for the user wait here. So that's more descriptive of which kind of value will be stored in that variable. Now with that, we got the user wait, and now we can repeat that for the height. These red squiggly lines here, by the way, are just showing up because we're not using wait input anywhere else then, but we'll change that later. For the moment, let's instead just also fetch the height input here, And I'll do that in the same way as before, using the reader and then actually waiting for the enter key to be pressed to then actually, well, store the entered value as the height input. Now with that, we got our two inputs here. And to see whether that works, I'll just print them here, not print ln, but just print. And I'll print the weight input and then also print the height input. And if everything works, we should be prompted for our two values, weight and height. We should be able to enter them and confirm them by pressing the enter key. And then once we entered both weight and height, we should see what we entered below all the other output. So with that, if we save this, and I now open that terminal again here, if I run my module with go run dot, indeed here you see I get this prompt, please enter your weight, and you see that execution pauses now. It placed the cursor here in the same line as please enter your weight, and it does so because we're using print and not print ln here. So we're not adding a line break after this text. Hence we can enter our input in the same line. That's what I talked about before. And here I can now enter my weight, 72 kilograms in my case, and hit enter. And now you see we move on to that next prompt. Please enter your height in meters. And in my case, that's 1.78. And if I hit enter again, then indeed I get my output here. So that is working. But we will not yet be able to use these two values for calculating the body mass index. And we'll dive into why that's the case in the next lecture.